Okay, Fiona and Colm, over to yourselves. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, and thanks for inviting us along to meet with you this evening. I'm Colm O'Gorman, I'm the Executive Director of Amnesty International here in Ireland, and I'm joined in this evening's meeting by Fiona Crowley, who's our Research and Legal Manager and who's leading on this piece of work for us in Amnesty here in Ireland. So Fiona shortly is going to talk us through the research and what it established and what our key recommendations are, and just to give us a headline take on all of that. But I suppose just to kind of set the frame a little bit here, I thought it might be useful for us to talk about, well, first of all, why did Amnesty decide to do research on Ireland specifically, and why now? So this is the second time that Amnesty International has conducted in-depth research on the rights of sex workers in Europe. The first time was in 2016 when we published the report Norway, the human cost of crushing the market. That followed on from Amnesty's global decision in 2015 to adopt policy on the human rights of sex workers, and that obviously that policy and that legal framework, that human rights framework, is what underpins all of our research. So Ireland was chosen for this piece of work, for this specific piece of research, for a number of reasons. First of all, as you've already flagged, and as the Green Party have already fed into this review, the Irish Department of Justice and Equality, it's currently reviewing the impact of Part 4 of the Criminal Law Sexual Offences Act 2017. That's the law that was introduced that criminalised the purchase of sexual services. And whilst that review is ongoing, we really believe that this research offers valuable evidence on sex workers' human rights violations in Ireland as part of this process, and that it can and should support sex workers' demands in Ireland. I mean, critical from our perspective was in ensuring that the lived experiences and the voices of sex workers, as those who are most impacted by a legal framework that's applied to them and to their lives, needed to be centered in any review of the law or any discussion on their lives. Then, of course, following on from that point, it really is time that this research was timely, it was necessary. Sex workers are largely excluded from conversations about laws and policies that affect their lives. Their voices are mostly ignored or misrepresented in mainstream media and in other channels of influence. And at the same time, there have been some reports of increased reporting of violence against sex workers in Ireland after the reform of the Sexual Offences Act in 2017 in academic studies and from ugly mugs. Many sex workers here in Ireland have also told us that they are perceived by wider society as vectors of disease, in need of rehabilitation, as fallen women who fail to have control over their own sexuality and lives, or as people who pose a risk to decent society. So in Ireland, I mean, obviously, those views and that stigmatization is compounded by a very moralistic approach about sex and sexual autonomy under the long-standing influence of the Catholic Church. So again, reinforcing the notion that sex work is deviant and immoral. Sex workers are then telling us that this perception is translated into a lack of interest, a lack of awareness, or even empathy for sex workers' rights in wider society. In addition, legislation that criminalizes sex work has exacerbated the stigma, even if selling sex is not an illegal activity. As you know, that is, unless sex workers work together indoors, which of course is penalized, because everything around sex work or everything evolved around sex work then is a crime in and of itself. So conversations around sex work are often perceived as controversial. That great silencer of much discourse here in Ireland, oh, this is a controversial issue, so it's hard to get into it. And that means that we see then a result that causes disengagement or a reluctance, more often than not, in particular, to take a sex workers' rights approach by civil society groups. So, broadly, our take on this is that Ireland generally is failing to acknowledge the rights of sex workers, the dignity of sex workers, and certainly is refusing to take on board their voices and perspectives. So with this research and the campaign that will flow from it, we really hope that we can trigger a much needed conversation in Ireland and elsewhere, because this, of course, research is part of Amnesty's global work on this issue. So we see this as significant beyond Ireland. We want to really be part of triggering conversations about sex workers' human rights. So I mean, a critical point there, and I've referenced it a couple of times, about the voices and the agency of sex workers. Amnesty will not and should not be leading the charge here in Ireland. Sex workers are, and they have been for a very long time. But we want to add weight and a much needed human rights angle to the conversation about sex work, as well as evidence about the abuses and violations they experience because of the laws that criminalize sex work, among other factors. And evidence has largely been absent from much of the policy or political discussions around sex workers and sex workers' rights here in Ireland thus far. Sex workers have human rights. So we stand in solidarity with sex workers in Ireland, like we do with everyone whose rights are being violated. And as a leading human rights organisation, we will place Sex Workers' Human Rights and Agency at the heart of the conversation about sex work and support their right to be heard. Hopefully you've all had an opportunity at this point to read the research, and you'll see that critical for us, as I've said all the way through this introduction, has been not just centering, but amplifying and ensuring that we elevate the voice and the experience of sex workers. And this research deliberately placed sex workers' voice at the center of the research and the report itself. They know more than anyone else about what needs to change in Ireland, so their human rights are respected and so that they can live a freedom from violence and stigma. So I again just want to reiterate our gratitude to all of the sex workers who shared their time, their stories, their testimonies and their opinions with us as part of this research, and hopefully you've had a chance to look at that. And we really hope that we and the research will be able to contribute to the relentless activism and efforts of sex workers to be heard and for their rights to be upheld. And for us, that's the critical piece. So again, our role in this as a human rights organisation is to apply that human rights framework, to reveal and expose and document the human rights abuses that flow from Ireland's legal framework around sex work, but critically to ensure that the voices and perspectives and experiences of sex workers are heard and directly impact and significantly influence decisions that have been made about their lives, about their rights, and critically about their safety. So Fiona Crowley, who I mentioned earlier on, is our research and legal manager, and she's leading on the work here in Amnesty Ireland. The research obviously was undertaken at the global level, so in cooperation between ourselves and our colleagues at our International Secretariat. But I'm going to hand over to Fiona now in the first instance, who will take us through the key points and recommendations from the research. Fiona?
Oh, thanks very much. Can you all hear me? Great, thanks. Sorry, I've borrowed my son's laptop, so I'll try to be very brief because I know that we're probably a little bit over our speaking time already. So just in terms of what Colm said, I'll just add to the fact that this was a joint research project with our European Regional Office, and we will be running the campaign within the European region as well as domestically. And I'm in the midst of putting together the domestic campaign strategy for that. So we'll be working on this for the coming years. So in terms of the research itself, we interviewed 20 sex workers from very diverse backgrounds and with very different lived experiences. Some were engaged in street work, some indoors, some in different settings. We were delighted that we could include cis and transgender women, non-binary people, and a small number of men, and we were able to cover both Irish and migrant workers. It's important to say at the outset that the research was not aimed at evaluating the 2017 Act or the so-called Nordic model. Rather, our sole intention was to talk to sex workers about their experiences of violence and what helped ensure their safety or put them at further risk. So in terms of the what Colm was saying, you know, the reasons why we did the research, well, the research did pretty much bear out kind of like all of the predictions and assumptions that we had made. So indeed, almost all of the sex workers that we interviewed do experience significant levels of violence as part of their work in the form of physical attacks, threats, sexual violence, rape, robberies, stalking, all of the violence that we see kind of like right throughout the world, mainly from clients, but also members of the public. So I guess this isn't terribly new, but what is new is that the structures that the state purports to have in place to protect sex workers, including the very premise of the 2017 Part 4, Part 4 of the 2017 Act, they are not actually considered to be making sex work safer, rather exacerbating the violence and risk that sex workers are being exposed to. So the sex workers told us, of course, that the 2017 Act makes them liable themselves to arrest and prosecution under the Brothel Keeping Act, but also living off the earnings. But it also makes them more vulnerable to violence and abuse by clients themselves. The law on brothel keeping, while the Gardaí say that they are not enforcing it against sex workers anymore, it is to the fore of sex workers' minds that sex workers have been arrested and prosecuted and in fact put in jail for simply working together for safety. And so this is creating a chilling effect whereby sex workers are fearful that as the law is written, they are in fact committing an offence and they have no guarantee that they won't be arrested and prosecuted. So many are having to work indoors by themselves, even though this increases the risk of violence from potentially abusive clients. There are also clients that know that brothel keeping is an offence, and they threaten to have the sex workers arrested when they find that they are working together, and therefore sex workers are fearful of reporting violence, robberies, and so on that happens. So the offence is also impacting on street-based sex workers. It's often overlooked that many of those would prefer to work indoors, but they're afraid to do so because they want to work together for safety, but they cannot, and they fear prosecution and everything that would bring to their lives. And particularly with the particular experiences of street workers, it often is an often chaotic existence, and they would very much like to be able to formalise it in indoor settings, but just are too fearful of the police to be able to do that. So the ban on buying sex is, as predicted, impacting sex workers' safety and livelihoods. They are deprioritising their own safety to get clients. Sex work has gone even more underground since the purchase of sex was criminalised, and it is more dangerous. Street workers report being highly surveilled by police, and they feel that is harassment in itself, but also deters clients. So they have to be less visible and work in isolated areas where violence is more prevalent. The migrant sex workers report additionally experiencing layers of fear if they report violence due to immigration laws and the lack of a firewall between police, ordinary policing, and the immigration functions that all police carry. Sex workers we interviewed completely lack confidence in the police. We met with the police actually just before the research and subsequently, and including the Garda Commissioner, and they genuinely believed that they have built trust with sex workers. According to the sex workers that we do, they certainly have not. The vast majority told us that they had never and would never report violence to the Gardaí due to stigma at the hands of the Gardaí or lack of faith that anything would be done. But actually, many fear violence from the Gardaí themselves. Many reported attacks, robberies, and harassment at the hands of the Gardaí. This particularly so from street-based sex workers. Sex workers also fear that the police will arrest them. And again, the fear of immigration enforcement and deportation. A very interesting example of where the police thought that they were doing something useful was that they sent out a text message to sex workers that they were able to glean their numbers from the escort sites online, thinking that it would be a nice thing to do in COVID, and it panicked many. So it's just without talking to sex workers directly, we very much are concerned that the police are making assumptions based on the fact that they believe that most, if not all, sex workers are exploited or victims of trafficking that need to be effectively policed for their own good. So the stigma just generally around public stigma has been exacerbated by the sex buyer ban, and this again deters sex workers from reporting crimes. They feel that they won't be believed, and this is often exacerbated by intersecting forms of discrimination based on ethnicity, race, gender, and gender identity. The level of aggression and abuse from the public, particularly for street sex workers, but also those working indoors, has increased. increased. So in totality, what sex workers described was what they call a context of structural violence, where in addition to the individual experiences of violence that that often is assumed to be part of the package when you engage in sex work, that the very agencies of state and services of state that are meant to be there to protect sex workers and to provide them with justice if they do report, that they are actually having the reverse effect. So, and the systemic barriers to reporting are also exacerbated then by gender and economic equality. And the big thing that struck us from most of the interviews was the housing crisis and the risk of being homeless are key issues, key drivers not only for people being in sex work, but also remaining in sex work, and key issues where people's fear of eviction, and particularly through the brothel keeping law, is preventing them from reporting what's their experiences to the police or to landlords. So I won't. I know that we're running out of time, so I won't go into, like, there's this whole pile more in the report. But to get to the core issues, though, it's very clear that while the intention of the 2017 law, Part 4, was to shift police focus from sex workers to clients, that isn't happening. And even if it were, it's certainly eroding the focus on exploitation, abuse, and trafficking. It was interesting speaking with the Gardaí, and they too are under the impression that the overwhelming majority of people working in sex work are not actually clearly sex workers, because that's consensual, but they are actually being exploited or trafficked. And therefore, it's this fundamental assumption that this is a policing matter, that is at the root of the reluctance to change practice. There's also just more widely the conflation of sex work with trafficking, exploitation, and across other areas of law, policy, and practice. And at the very core of that is a complete lack of data. Before the Part 4 was enacted, we repeatedly asked the Department of Justice, including in our submission, to engage in research as it happened in Northern Ireland, and to do some baseline mapping of who are sex workers. It's a very broad brush of people. What are their experiences and what are their needs? And that didn't happen. So they have, as Colm said, been excluded from conversations around this, including in the enactment of the law itself. And we're very concerned that they may also not be fully included in its review. So these are, if you want meaningful laws, you need to have meaningful engagement with the rights holders that are ostensibly at the heart of these laws. So I'll wrap it up at that point, but there's much more maybe we can get into in the conversation afterwards.
Thanks very much, Fiona and Colm. That was really, really interesting. And I guess the main takeaway that I have from this is that an hour is definitely not enough to really dive into all of the issues that need to be addressed in this industry, and to make sure that we are ensuring that people are afforded their proper rights and safety. I'll hand over now to Dr Caoimhe Ní Dhónaill from Queen's University Belfast, and she'll take us through her experience of the policy in Northern Ireland in relation to sex workers. Thank you, Caoimhe.
Thank you, and thank you very much first for inviting me, and also to our colleagues at Amnesty International. You're going to find a lot of what we find in Northern Ireland is repeated in Northern Ireland in terms of the impacts of the Nordic model. I'm going to be a share screen nightmare, sorry about that, but there's just lots of numbers and I won't remember them. Can everyone see my screen okay? Thumbs up.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
That's great, thank you. So I'm going to be taking us through what happened with the Nordic model in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is a really important place, not just because I'm from Belfast and I think that, but in terms of sex work legislation, because we're the actually only place, or we're the first place, and I believe to this day are the only place that did research immediately before, a year before the Nordic model was put into place, and then 4 years after it had been in place. So we are the only place that has direct comparable numbers between how many sex workers were operating, what level of demand there was, etc., before the Nordic model and afterwards. Because obviously components of the Nordic model, and you will see this in literature quite a bit, where they'll say, the demand for sex work decreased once the Nordic model was brought in, but without having that information about what sex work was like before, they cannot make claims to what sex work was, to what levels of demands went up or down, whatever. So Northern Ireland becomes very important in being and having that directly comparable data. And also, very importantly, a lot of the same researchers. So we were able to access the same, like the huge data sets that we used for both pieces of research. So before 2015, Northern Ireland Sex work is generally seen as a private matter, and in terms of consent and sex work between two adults, and if two people can go to a room and have sex for whatever reason that they choose, and if money is exchanged hands, that wasn't a legal issue, or wasn't followed up in any real ways. With the exception of specific sexual offences, specifically bans to solicit and brothel keeping, definition of brothel keeping becomes really important in all of this. Maybe keep that for the conversation afterwards. Exploitation and trafficking, they were all already illegal. So just the act of sex between consent and adults for money was primarily seen as a private matter. However, there was a lot of campaigning by Lord Moore from the DUP, coming from a very conservative Christian background and linked up with radical feminists. You know, that really like very obvious and natural link between the DUP and particular groups to push a Nordic model, or the purchase of sex buyers law model of legislation. They argued that basically, well, from the conservative Christian, that the moral fibre of the country was at risk, and they were pointing at things like, you know, pushes for legislation about abortion and pushes for legislation about same-sex marriage, etc. We're kind of looking at the whole moral fibre of the country was at risk, and so to have this open sex work law where people could go and have sex for reasons that weren't marriage would be terrible. And they also tied it to human trafficking legislation, and this is something you'll see repeated over and over, which is a very clever move in terms of campaigning, because if you're going against the sex work legislation, then you're accused of not having sympathy or empathy towards people who've been trafficked. But as has been mentioned by our colleagues here at Amnesty International, this is problematic for loads of reasons, primarily because not all people who work in sex work are trafficked, and not all people who are trafficked work in sex work. And indeed, most people who are trafficked are not trafficked for sex. So to have a law that ties these so closely together is excluding a lot of people who actually need help. So like I say, we did research immediately before and immediately after, which allowed us to compare. I'm just going to run the numbers very quickly. So that's 2014. The research was commissioned by the Department of Justice, and I was involved in that research. We surveyed data with 171 sex work response and 446 client response. We had 19 sex worker interviews, 10 client interviews. That's the only part that we couldn't repeat, because the Department of Justice funded both bits of research, and they wouldn't let us interview clients in the second research because those clients were now breaking the law. So we couldn't interview them. Data scraping from a number of sex work websites, and then interviews with various experts and service providers. And then this was repeated in 2019. So the law came in 2015, and we 4 years later looked at what happened. So we had a sex worker survey with 199 responses from that. And we did have 193 client responses, which was much lower than the previous research. We think that's because of the law coming in, that people were a bit more concerned about, even in an anonymous survey, representing themselves. We did quantitative analysis of 173,000 advertising profiles from 3 years before and after the law changed. Escort Ireland in particular were very helpful in allowing us to have access to that data, which allowed us to look at exactly how many adverts were before and after to see what the impact was. Web scraped data from advertising platforms, where we looked at and by we, I mean, I looked at every single sex work advertising advert in Northern Ireland every day for 6 days. And what I found is that it becomes amazing how quickly you become nonplussed to seeing bums. So that was an interesting week of my life. And then client survey, and then we had narrative interviews with sex workers, interviews with sex work supporting organisations, and with the police and the public prosecution service. So what did we find? Find that on average there's about 308 sex workers working on any given day in Northern Ireland. The vast majority are female, only 2.9% represented as male. We don't necessarily think that represents all male sex workers. We think male sex workers are advertising very different ways. There's a lot more opportunistic sex work. There's a lot more using like Grindr, etc. So we don't have the adverts to do the comparison. But vast majority are female. Very high proportion of trans and non-binary sex workers compared to the population. That's because of difficulty in getting other types of work. The vast majority is off-street sex work. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Most commonly expressed nationality: Spanish, Brazilian, and I can't see the last one, so I think it was Italian. These two groups represented about 40% express nationality. We don't necessarily think that was true. We think that people potentially representing desirable nationalities compare, we think quite a number of sex workers would be from the Roma community, but would be concerned about discrimination. So representing as other nationalities. The average expressed age is 31. People take years off their age, that's fine, I do it. In terms of qualifications, I find that there's really significant amounts of qualifications. So, and quite a number of the interviews when I was arranging to meet up with sex workers to do the interviews, like a lot of them would go, I'll just pop up to your office after my lecture, because there's quite a number who were active students as well. So the narrative that is presented, especially by proponents of the law, is that sex workers are people who are totally without agency, who are absolutely desperate, who are totally vulnerable, who are exploited and trafficked and pushed into sex work and have no choice in it. And what we find is that's just not the case. It's not that there are no people who are trafficked for sex. It's not that there are no people who are desperate and vulnerable, etc. But to take away all agency from all sex workers and present sex workers as only being one type of person is really problematic. That also allowed them, having that idea of what a sex worker is, justified them not talking to sex workers before the law came in. So they would say, like, sex workers don't have agency, so we need to speak for them because they can't speak for themselves. So our research found that just wasn't the case. What we found was, like I said, 308 sex workers advertising in a day, no reduction from the 2014 research. We actually saw significant increases with about 23.2% more sex work adverts in the period that we're researching. So demand is not going down, despite the fact that the argument is that if you are criminalizing the client, then they will be less likely to demand sex workers. Large decrease in male sex workers. We actually think that's just because male sex workers, as I said earlier, advertise in different ways. Mostly focused in urban centres, but not exclusively. Most pronounced increase, County Tyrone, 34%. We don't know why, but it's interesting. And we also find with the clients that we surveyed, only 11% said that the law would dissuade them from purchasing sex. So the law having come in is not decreasing demand and not decreasing or dissuading clients. So in terms of what its express purpose is, it is not doing it. I also think it's really important to note that the 11% of surveyed clients, we find them on sex purchasing websites. So despite the fact that they're saying in a survey that they're more likely to be dissuaded from purchasing sex, they found the survey because they were purchasing sex. So not that dissuaded. One of the things that came in whenever they said would come in and they asked us to research was people exiting sex work. So they said, look, this Nordic model is going to reduce demand so much that sex workers are going to leave sex work, and we're going to put in place support systems for people who want to exit sex work. They did not do that. They did not put in the exit service. I think they created a little card that signposted them to job seekers, but they didn't do anything in any real way. So that's very difficult to capture why people leave sex work. We have evidence that on-street sex work selling has decreased, but on-street sex selling in Northern Ireland is very small. There were only around 20 sex workers. We knew who they were, or the certain support organisations knew who they were. It's gone down to about 10. But we don't have information about where they've gone. And we also know that exit sex work is often not permanent. So we would have had people filling in the survey saying, well, I'm not doing sex work right now, but I'll probably do it again coming up to Christmas. So it's really like exit sex work is hard to capture. And then we also have a lot of migrant sex workers who might leave the area, but don't leave sex work. And as I say, despite promises, the Northern Irish government did not put in any target support for people exiting sex work. So again, in terms of this law was put forward by certain politicians as being a compassionate and empathetic response to vulnerability, to desperation, to exploitation. But what they didn't do was put any support for those people who they have said were so vulnerable and exploited, etc. So what their actual purpose was, at least questions what the actual purpose was. Legislation, from all evidence gathered, had no impact on trafficking at all. In fact, had no real impact on sex work. So with no real impact on sex work, it was really hard to see what impact it could have on trafficking. And one of the reports that we got back from the police, or one of the things came up with the police interviews, was that in terms of sex trafficking, one of the major ways they got information about trafficked people or potentially trafficked people was through clients. As a client would go to a house or whatever and just be uncomfortable, say, see a lock outside a door, or women looking at like they're in distress, and they would have, you know, potentially reported that to the police, and that was one way that they could potentially find sex trafficked women. But now that the client is criminalized, they're not doing that anymore. So that that part of information is now disappeared, or that potential that right for information has disappeared. And again, as I said earlier, National Police Chiefs Council has advised UK police not to create sex work trafficking because, as I said, not all people who are trafficked are sex workers, not all sex workers are trafficked people. Very upsettingly, oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry, one of the things on demand, I just quickly, one of the things, or one of my favorite findings, or even two very upsetting findings, was that immediately after the law came in, there was, like, we find this in client interviews and in the advertising, was a huge spike in demand for sex work for about 4 or 5 months after the law came in. And the only way that the sex workers would just give any sort of potential reason for this was because the DUP were on the radio so much and on the news so much, talking about the fact that you could go to these websites and purchase sex, that they meant people knew about it. So actually the DUP and everything they did probably caused a spike in demand for sex work. But safety and well-being, and this is an area that I'm now just getting back into researching, that basically crimes against sex workers are hugely underreported. About 40% say they would never ever report anything to the police. The majority said they would rarely report anything to the police. And the police also don't keep specific records on crimes against sex workers. It's not a protected category. But Ugly Mugs data shows that reports of assault rose by over 200% from 2016 to 2018, and was an over 600% increase in abusive phone calls and 200% increase in threatening behaviour. And sex workers all said this is related to the law. The law is, again, by its proponents, it's put forward as being a way of protecting the sex worker. The sex worker is not criminalised, only the person who has purchased sex is criminalised. But what that actually did was change the power balance between sex worker and clients. The client would then be going, well, I'm the only one taking the risk here. You'll be fine if we get arrested. Nothing will happen to you. Something will happen to me. And so for that, I want you to take part in the sexual practice that you said that you would on your advert. I want you to lower your price because I'm taking the risk. I am not meeting you at a location you've chosen because the police could be watching it. I am not meeting you in a place where there's another person for your safety, because that could be someone undercover who could report me. So law became used as a bartering tool, which totally changes the power balance between sex worker and client in the exact opposite way that its proponents suggest that it would. And finally, at the time that we were doing the research, when we talked to the police, there had only been 2 arrests under this law. Neither were related to sex work and neither were related to human trafficking. So the 2 arrests at the time, and there have been very few since, were related to street harassment. So in the first instance, in the first case, it was a man who was shouting abusive and sexually explicit sort of threats to a young girl on the street, an underage girl on the street. And as part of this shouting, this part of the street harassment, he said something along the lines of, I'll give you £50 if you do X. So when a member of the public phoned the police, they didn't have enough evidence to get him on street harassment, but they went, well, he tried to buy sex because he said to this girl who was not a sex worker, if you give me 50 quid, then I'll do X. And so we're able to downgrade what they should have been arrested for, which was street harassment of a minor, to a sex work misdemeanor. And the second one was quite similar. There was a fella who came up to a garage or like a petrol station where there was an Eastern European cleaner working. It was in the morning, like 9 in the morning, and he something similar, some similar interaction. I'll give you X amount of money if you do X. And again, when the police came to do the arrest, they couldn't really prove an awful lot, but somebody overheard this like attempted purchase of sex. So he was arrested under that. But for that woman, she went through turmoil because her family then had read about this in the news, assumed that she was a sex worker, and she was basically told she wasn't welcome back into her own family. So there's all the stigma of sex work was put on someone who was not a sex worker. So in terms of protecting vulnerable people, the law has done nothing. It has made people significantly less safe. In the research that we did immediately before the law came in, like 98% of sex workers said this law will make us less safe. The DUP and proponents of the Nordic model would not listen to sex workers. They would not listen to this. And even though we provided them with this evidence, there were, I think, 8 occasions in the assembly where one of the DUP members said, but we don't need evidence. So this is what you're coming up against. They said, we don't need evidence. If we can save one woman from being trafficked, this law will be worth it. Well, that's what they've managed to do, is stop someone being put on the sex offenders register for harassing a child. My talks never end on a happy note, they just end. So that's sort of what we find so far, and I'm very happy to take any questions on this. I'll stop sharing the screen.
Thank you so much, Caoimhe. I hope you're doing okay. I can hear a few coughs. Unfortunately, COVID is still rife.
You know what it is? I don't have COVID. I just have a toddler. So
I had similar.
He just goes
similar,
fresh, licks every child he can find, and then comes home and licks me. So this has been
very similar here. The flu a few weeks ago because of it. Before we just dive into the Q&As, I know I have a couple myself. I'd just like to invite Linda Kavanagh. She's communications with the Sex Workers Alliance of Ireland. Just to speak just before we dive into the questions. And if you want to have a think of your questions in the meantime, maybe the best way to do it is just use the hands up icon. And if you want to pop your hands up now, just while Linda is speaking, so just so I can get ready to call on people once Linda's finished. Thanks a million.
Very sorry I didn't prepare anything. So just also, oh God, I don't even know where to begin. Like, it's so vital for this, the research that has been done, the new research with Amnesty and then the Queen's University. It's so vital because it's such an underrepresented demographic, and the reason the Sex Workers Alliance exists, initially it was set up by academics, and what was happening was they were finding that when they were researching sex work and sex workers, they weren't hearing the dominant narrative in Ireland. They were hearing that actually sex workers wanted something different, and they were experiencing the police in a very negative way, etc., as the findings of this research has shown. And that's the reality. And like 10 years later, like obviously the needle is moving, and it's really heartening to have a political party in the Dáil that is supportive of decriminalisation. But obviously there's still a really long way to go. And it seems really like kind of basic, but as Colm kind of emphasize, like the voices of sex workers have to be heard. Like, this seems obvious, but it really is not happening in the mainstream narrative in Ireland. Like, there is a lot of there's a lot of stuff coming out now, and there's survivor-led movements and this kind of stuff, but like the real experts are the people who worked under the law. They're active sex workers now, or active sex workers in the last 4 years. And there is such a stigma in Ireland and elsewhere. But really, I would have to say, because I look at other countries, even in Europe, and the community of sex workers is so underground here, is so hard. I don't want to say hard to reach, but like absolutely do not want the attention of the Gardaí in particular, but also of society. There's such a stigma, there's such a fear, people really fear that, because most of the sex workers that we talk to are single mothers, they're feared that their kids are going to get taken off them or they're going to get evicted. The stigma is so strong in Ireland that it's really, really hard to have a very visible community because the stigma is so strong. I'm going to wrap it up here and give time for questions.
Thanks for that, Linda. And I just think that that point about stigma is so important just before we head into the Q&A, because in not including the voices of sex workers, what we've ended up with is at best an experiment that has failed, and at worst something that could result in a fatality, which is extremely concerning. I'll go to, is it Myra or Mari? I'm not 100% sure. Apologies with my butchering of the Irish language here this evening.
Hello, it's Maura O'Higgins, and thanks
Maura.
for this evening. It's really important to hear all sides of people. It's really important to have everybody's voice, and I think the mistake has been made in not including everybody's voice. I have a question, and please don't. If it's an inappropriate, I don't think it's an inappropriate question. I'd like to put it to Colm on behalf of Amnesty. For maybe as an Amnesty representative, he can answer it and challenge me if it's the wrong question to ask. But I think we don't have the conversations about sex in this country that we need to have coming out of the grip the church had on this country. And my question is this, Colm, do you think it's a human right to be able to buy access to the body of another human being?
Thanks, Maura. Yeah, no, it's not an inappropriate question. I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask questions. I think one of the most important things to start with is to make the point that our policy on sex work and our position on sex work is grounded in a concern for the human rights of sex workers. So as the most marginalized, as one of the most vulnerable groups in society, any legal framework that is put in place to regulate their lives, or even to deliver some other socially desirable outcome on the basis of some other set of principles or beliefs, should not impact or violate their rights even further, should not leave them even more at risk of further human rights violations. And that's the reason for this policy. Does somebody have a right to purchase sex from other people? People obviously have a right to exercise agency and to decide whether or not to enter into consensual sexual relationships. Nobody has a right to exploit another person. And our policy position is very, very clear in that regard. We have no difficulty at all with the notion that those who exploit other people should be criminalized. We absolutely have no difficulty at all with the idea that trafficking as a crime should be criminalized, and that those responsible for it should be investigated, prosecuted, brought to trial, and if convicted, held accountable before the law. As a matter of fact, we campaigned for many years for increased and better trafficking legislation here in Ireland and in many other countries. But I think that the critical point is that in the pursuit of either a philosophical or a principled position that sees sex work as inherently exploitative, or that takes a position that to purchase sex from an individual is to exploit them. And I accept that can be a principled position. I accept that there's a set of beliefs that underpin that position. But in the pursuit of that, those who want to abolish sex work are unfortunately leaving the most marginalized individuals who are in any way involved in sex work, and some of the most marginalized individuals in our society, they're subjecting to them to increased danger and to increased human rights violations. So our concern is for the human rights of sex workers first and foremost.
Thanks for that Colm. Moira, do you have any follow-up? I'm sure we could discuss all night. I'm just conscious of other.
Yeah, no, it's thank you, Colm, for that. You haven't answered my question, as in, do you? And I so get your point about the principles, and I think people can very easily take the high moral ground, and that is wrong. People are entitled to do what they want with their lives, and you talk about it being exploitative as being the purpose of having that principle. For me, it's not. And I suppose, do you personally believe that you have the right to buy access to the body of another human being. And I suppose if I don't go to the question of me, do I personally have the right to have access to another person's body by virtue of buying it? No, I damn well don't. And I'm speaking from emotional experience of people close to me having been victims of that. And the word victim is wrong as well, because people are talking about sex work. So my question, Colm, goes back to you, really. And maybe it's enough. Maybe I've asked enough. It was to you I was asking, because I think if we don't start with me and how I am.
I understand the fact that you're asking the question of me personally, but I think we need to acknowledge that I'm here representing Amnesty International, and I'm speaking on behalf of one of the world's largest human rights organization based on our policies, our analysis, and our research. So my personal opinion in that regard, frankly, in many ways is irrelevant. I certainly, on a personal level, don't believe that anybody has the right to exploit another person, but I also think that people have agency, and that's one of the things that we absolutely have to respect. So you'll forgive me if I don't answer the question, because I don't think it's actually appropriate in the context of this conversation, because I'm speaking for Amnesty International in this context. And when we come to a position, it's a position that's grounded in legal analysis, in international human rights law, and in careful and methodical research and evidence. So that's what we've presented in this report, as opposed to, and I don't mean to denigrate the position, as opposed to our personal view, opinion, or feeling, or philosophy. We don't base our positions as a human rights organization who work grounded in law on opinion.
Thanks, Colm. And I would agree that as policy shapers and formers, it's not our responsibility to say what we agree or disagree with, but rather to ensure that people's rights are respected and adhered to not insofar as possible, in every possible way that we can do so. And that's certainly what I would, as I'm a counsellor, so I'm speaking from that perspective. I'd always like to see policy shaped to ensure that people's human rights are enshrined regardless of their occupation, or regardless of my personal beliefs. That's just something I feel quite strongly about. I see Fiona's her hand up to come in there as well. I'm guessing, is it in response to this, Fiona, or can we move on to another question?
Just because my whatever remit covers kind of like providing law and policy advice to the organization. So this is a policy about the human rights of sex workers. Like, that is it. So we're not at all engaging in in the buyers of sex or anyone outside of sex workers. But I do think it's important to say that, I mean, there is a prevailing view that like all sex work is violence against women. We do not adhere to that view. The CEDAW Convention talks about the exploitation of prostitution, not prostitution being a form of a human rights violation against women. So essentially, what we are looking for is for the rights and agency of sex workers to make decisions about their own bodies, health and lives, in the same way as we campaigned for, women, girls and pregnant people more generally to have their decisions about their bodies, health and lives respected in the context of abortion. I mean, there are lots of things about that people tried to bring in, or thought were relevant. Well, actually, there's nothing really relevant other than the woman who is pregnant. In the same context, we are not talking about anybody's rights, buyers or otherwise, other than the person who is selling sex. And if that sex is consensual, and if the terms are agreed between two consenting parties, then that has nothing to do with us, what the buyer's perspective may or may not be, because we are simply talking about the rights of the sex worker, the autonomy and agency of the sex worker. And for us to negate that as somehow that they don't know what they're doing, that's the problem. So if there is any element of coercion, abuse, manipulation, exploitation, that's what the law should be dealing with. We're very happy. Like, there are loads of provisions that the police could be pursuing if they really want to get, into, say, beyond exploitation and trafficking, but into abusive or coercive clients. Sure, go after them, but that's not what we're talking about. And if the laws aren't fit for purpose, and you have to have on the statute books things like living off the earnings or brothel keeping, or to try and go after organised gangs or whatever, well, then the law is wrong. and clearly, like, sort of, you know, the very poor level of prosecutions and arrests of clients, abusive or otherwise, it's testament to the fact that the laws are not fit for purpose. So again, this is about the human rights of sex workers, full stop.
Thanks, Fiona, and thanks for bringing us back to the conversation and what we're centering it around, which is the rights of sex workers, regardless of the circumstances. NASA?
Thank you, and thanks so much to all the speakers tonight, because it's been like a really excellent session, and I've learned loads. And I just have a couple of really quick questions, I guess, for the speakers. And just to say, actually, I agree with Fiona. I was just thinking that it reminds me of that abortion. Like people probably know I'm like a very passionate repealer, but that doesn't necessarily translate to whether I would necessarily get a procedure myself. So I think that that's a good analogy. And I'm very impressed that Caoimhe got to get through that presentation feeling the way you obviously do. And very sorry that Colm is leaving us. So thank you for all your work, Colm. I know you're getting lots of that on Twitter, but you will be missed. I guess one of my questions is, I feel like, and obviously we had a huge, in the Green Party, we had like a huge discussion in 2017 and 2016 when this law came in and when it was being discussed. And I feel like, and maybe I'm wrong, but a lot of the research that is here in front of us tonight was kind of there in 2017 and 2016. It seems very similar. And I'm wondering, you know, in the research that's been done since, have we found other things emerged that we weren't aware of and that we need to be aware of? And you know, like, so what's the divergence, or are we seeing what we expected to see? Because I remember those policy discussions, and very much, you know, what was described tonight is what we were expecting. And just to say, I have questioned the Minister a few times about the inclusion of sex workers in the review of the legislation, and he keeps guaranteeing me that they are. We'll see when it's done. And then the second question was, I was really, I really heard that issue around kind of that I think Colm said about lack of interest and empathy from kind of decision makers and people in the body politic and people in media and everything. And I guess I don't necessarily always feel like we have the language around the lack of interest and empathy. And I wonder what the thoughts are around, you know, is it that we need to broaden trafficking? Like, obviously trafficking in fisheries is a huge issue in Ireland and we never talk about it. Trafficking in agriculture is a huge issue in other EU countries. You know, is there language that other countries are doing more successfully? I really notice it at the Gender Equality Committee every time I try and talk about sex workers, even in the context of violence, gender violence, it just gets completely shut down. So it's those two questions, I guess, to whoever wants to answer.
I'll throw that out to, yeah.
Well, I'm happy to jump in on that first question anyway, which is, yeah, we found exactly what we expected to find. We found exactly what sex workers have been telling us and have been repeatedly telling us. It's certainly in the north, but it certainly seems the same way in the south. And part of that, I suppose, is because of that lack of empathy or lack of listening or lack of respect for sex workers' voices, because like I said, there's nothing that came up in the research that we didn't expect. It was just really depressing because we knew that's what was going to happen. Sex workers told us before the law came in that this is exactly what the law was going to do. So we just keep focusing on that. It's really important that we have the evidence and that we have the comparable evidence from before and after, so that when opponents of the Nordic model do come across and say, oh, you know, it'll really reduce demand, we go, no, it doesn't. But we proved it. I'll maybe leave the second question for one of my down south colleagues.
I might just jump in on that point about sex workers' voices and perspectives being heard, and the suggestion that there was evidence. I mean, part, as Fiona said, part of our key critique of what happened in 2016 and 2017 as this legislation was being introduced is that there was very little evidence presented. Nobody could suggest that the 2017 Act is evidence-based policy or evidence-based legislation. It was ideological and philosophical. And people might see it as a principles-based approach, but it wasn't evidence-based, and it certainly didn't consider or listen to the perspective of sex workers. I mean, we've been lucky enough to have been working with SWAY since 2016, since soon after Amnesty adopted its global policy. And you know, the starkest piece to date is, I mean, Fiona's talked about some of our engagements in regards to Colm with others, and yes, I've heard what you've said about your hope about the review of the current legislation. I mean, I wouldn't say it's looking wildly positive at the moment, that review is really taking on board or considering or going after, like going out, that you would imagine in a review of a piece of legislation like this, that there would be a very determined and significant effort to go out and ensure that the perspectives and the experiences and the voices of sex workers very much informed the view. There's no evidence of that, and in fact, we're quite concerned that that's not the case. We'll see how the review plays out for the moment, but we're not seeing a significant departure in terms of a recognition of the need to include the voices and perspective of sex workers at this stage. Linda and Fiona, I'm sure, might want to come in on this particularly, because as you know, the review is ongoing at the moment.
If it's okay, I'm going to jump in just, I suppose, on newer research. There is research that's going to be released but has not been released yet, done by GOSH, and it's about street-based sex workers and their knowledge of the law and how they work around the law. And a big thing that is going to come out of that, or it's going to be released about that, is that a huge amount of street workers did not know about the law, and thereby, in a way, it didn't change the way that they operate, in that, like, street-based sex workers tend to be drug-using people, so sometimes mothers. They're already living a criminalized existence they're already fearful of the Gardaí, they're already do not want to be detected. And so, to me, like, so they're not aware, kind of, or what's supposed to be a changing relationship with the Gardaí hasn't really changed, even though the law has changed. That kind of shows, in reality, impact on the most vulnerable people. If we go by what the spirit of the law is supposed to be, it's not impacting them in any kind of positive way. They still extremely fear the police. And I suppose, so just to kind of, something I think about a lot with regards kind of empathy and trying to get visibility for a population who do not want to be visible. And there's a huge amount of need, especially I think after the two referenda of personal stories, and we know the personal stories work, but like, if you can't give a personal story, then nobody wants to hear it. Like, the evidence is there that the law does not work, and it is actively putting sex workers in danger, or at the very least creating an atmosphere of unsafety or lack of safety. That evidence is there, that data is there. In terms of, like, you can look at the Amnesty data, you can look at the Queen's University data, we've got a bit of research, you can look at global, like, it's France, there's been an increase in murders, ugly mugs, you know, in all these kind of things, but people want to hear a personal story, and that's just not going to happen. And I think that's a kind of a barrier. Yeah, that's kind of.
And I guess it comes back around again to that idea of the stigma, Linda, perhaps being a barrier for people coming forward with their personal stories. But I'll just, Fiona's looking to come in that as well.
And I promise I won't be jumping in anymore, because I see loads more hands in. But just to add to what Colm was saying there, just in terms of the government or the Department of Justice's review consultation, the terms of reference do specify that there must be participation and inclusion of survivors of trafficking, and I think it says, like, people who have engaged in prostitution. So I mean, obviously there has to be some element of consultation, but we're concerned that it's very, very limited. It's not the independent expert Maura Butler's fault. The responsibility lies with the Department of Justice and with the government. And we're very much concerned that it's going to be bringing in like some sex workers for a little bit of a chat and like rather than sort of assertive outreach, try and engage with marginalised groups and marginalised communities and really take on the full spectrum of experiences, of what is very much not a homogenous group. And so that's what we meant, that this should have been the priority, is like doing something way more than, funding GOSH and then like sort of expecting sex workers to present for like essentially interviews. There should be like a way more novel approach to engaging if this was to be meaningful.
If the speakers are okay, I'm going to suggest we extend till 8:15 just to bring in the last 3 questions, if that's okay. I understand, obviously you're giving up your time free this evening, but this has been a very engaging discussion. So I'll just ask Oliver to come in now.
Thanks very much, Karen, and thanks also to Fiona, Caoimhe, and Linda as well, and Colm too. I just wanted to ask Fiona, you mentioned a campaign strategy from Amnesty, and I feel like organisations who are opposed to these laws are on the back foot, and have been on the back foot when the laws were being introduced as well, and it was largely left to sex workers themselves. And as has been said, there's been a sidelining of sex workers' voices and so also of sex worker organisations in a way too. And I'd just like to hear more about that if that's possible. Thanks very much, Karen.
Thanks, Oliver. So can I ask just everyone to jump in as they'd like to answer?
I'll just jump in because the question was asked directly to me. Sorry, I did say I wouldn't speak anymore, but
Fiona, do not apologise, please. It's been enlightening.
Yeah, but just firstly for clarity, when I say the campaign, we have been working on this since 2015. We actually got permission from our international office to make a submission to the Department of Justice before our global policy was actually adopted. So we have been working with SWAY insofar as we have capacity to try and avert course at the time and like sort of point to the kind of like sort of the fundamental sort of misalignment of law with kind of like the intended outcome ever since. But when we say a campaign, what we mean is something that's a little bit more kind of like overt, and so it's just trying to really engage the society, and particularly young adults we feel might be to help us change the narrative. But again, our fundamental principle is that we're not here to speak on behalf of sex workers. It's trying to work with sex workers and with Linda and her organisation and others to the sex workers that we all have engagement with. And the Red Umbrella Front, as it starts to emerge as well, to try and make sure that we are bringing them to advocacy meetings, and we are like sort of essentially acting as a platform and ally. So that's what we mean. So but we have a long list of recommendations from right to housing down to kind of like abolish the law. But so we will be like working on this over a number of years. But that's what we mean by the campaign. It's more the kind of like the public engagement, public education type of work that we hope to start doing.
Thanks, Fiona. Do you have anything else there, Oliver? Are you happy enough with that?
I am. I suppose just to comment that I agree with the gist of what I picked up there, that I think, as you said, it hasn't been very overt. And I think maybe that might be a lot to do with the narratives around the issue and about kind of dominance of certain philosophical approaches to it. And I think Colm has verbalized that really well when the question was put to you earlier on, that it is actually about the rights of sex workers and focusing in on that. So I think there is scope and need for an overt discussion and campaign. As you say, it is about making sure sex workers' voices are heard, but there needs to be an overt campaign also of allies. So thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Oliver, and thanks for the response, Fiona. James, I'll hand over to you next.
Yeah, brilliant, thanks. And just to the speakers, fantastic contributions, very engaging. I guess my question is, it's been touched on a little bit, but I suppose going forward, now I know the campaign that Amnesty and other groups here are doing isn't to outrightly, well, it is to change, of course, the legislation we currently have. But my question kind of is, in the realm that we live in, where we have with Dáil arithmetic as it is, three main parties have either a anti or unconfirmed stance on such things. Whatever about, say, the Green Party, members of other parties, how do you go about changing the minds of the people who do hold the sway of power, whatever the balance of power? Is it just based on the evidence alone? That does work in some issues, but I think with such a strong moralistic stance of some of these other parties, it's a lot more difficult to get across. It's more of a broad question, but thank you.
Thanks so much, James, and I'll pass that over. And just to add to that question, if you could also, the question I had was around how do we address the lack of empathy as well in that regard?
I might come in briefly there. I think the first thing we have to do is not to assume what opinions are. I'm not suggesting you're doing that, by the way, James, but I think very often when we approach so-called controversial issues in Ireland, we're told that issues are controversial, or we're told that there isn't public support for a particular position, or because there's a dominant narrative that's out there, we're told that that's where public opinion is at. I think we've seen that upended on many occasions over the last numbers of years on so-called controversial issues, where actually it turned out there was very significant levels of consensus. You know, we don't think there's overwhelming public support for this law, and we particularly don't believe that there's overwhelming public support for what underpins this law, you know, the belief system or the positions that underpin this law. And we certainly don't think that there will be public support for this law if we demonstrate the harm that this law causes directly. So that's how we'll change opinions. And equally, the political system, as you know only too well, does respond to that. I mean, the political system does respond to evidence. In our experience, very often when you present evidence to people, and when you actually present it in a reasonable way, and also show through public engagement and public support that there is support for the change that's required, then you secure it. But I mean, you know, the Green Party will be significant. It will be significant in this obviously, as a party who are in government, who do have a policy position that chimes very much with elements of our recommendations and what we're saying as well. And we think there are supporters as well for this position in many of the other political parties.
Can I just jump in there as well, to say that I suppose from Sway's point of view, and then from other sex workers that I've spoken to as well, and to speak to Fiona's point, like a lot of young people like do not support the law, and I think that they're like, it's a mistake for a lot of parties, I think particularly Sinn Féin, to not address this or not move their position, because they've got a young voter base. So for me, I suppose the way my politics is, it's always go grassroots. It's you change it from the bottom up. Like the politicians will always be the last to change, and we have seen that over and over again. And I just like know, like there is significant opposition to sex work in a lot of civil society, but I think grassroots wise, young people really get it, and I think their voices is vital to kind of shake political parties, and again, I agree with Colm as well. Like it's actually quite funny. Sometimes you get funny bedfellows, probably the wrong word to use here, but like you do sometimes get, you know, people from what I would consider across the aisle to me, because they understand bodily autonomy, they understand it's people's private business, what happens in the bedroom. You know, sometimes it's, you know, they're coming at it from a very business minded way, that people are just trying to earn a living. So sometimes and then sometimes some of them know their their voter base are clients. So, you know, you can be surprised where the support can lie. But as I said, I do think any party that has a young voter base is making a mistake in not looking at the evidence and looking at the harm that's caused and considering a change in policy.
That's great. Thanks for that. James, do you have any other questions on that?
No questions, just full agreement. And I do think that a lot of the political parties are definitely missing the boat, to use the phrase, when it comes to supporting on this issue, my own included.
Thank you. And then I have a question from Mary C for Colm or Fiona. I agree, voice is very important. Can you explain how representative your interviewees are of the sex trade as a whole? There's a lot of evidence which tells us that the majority are migrant women with little or no English who are constantly on the move.
I can just jump in there. I mean, who knows? I mean, there have been many statistics advanced, but again, in the absence of like sort of any meaningful sort of, you know, a kind of research project, and would be a significant one. It's very hard to tell, but certainly, I mean, like there is evidence that there. I mean, firstly, we know that women are more disproportionately represented, and so on. So there's certain things that apply throughout all of Europe that are likely true here in Ireland. And you know, there is quite a lot of quite a lot of migrants working in the area, but it's just like it's impossible to say. And so, I mean, we don't consider at all that the 30 sex workers that we interviewed are representative. What does representative even mean? You'd have to, you know, I mean, engage with hundreds of people to even get like a, you know, like a sense of like the different life experiences and drivers and so on, you know. So it's just, yeah, it's an impossible question to answer. But we did speak with several migrants, and their experiences were very consistently about, you know, the things that I mentioned, experiences of racism, you know, both at this hands of the police, but also the public, you know, that fear of you know, immigration enforcement as opposed to kind of like sort of empathetic policing. So, yeah.
Thanks. And Mary, is there anything you'd like to?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I hear what Fiona's saying, but to ask us to rely on her evidence, given all of the other evidence out there, and to dismiss that, I'm a little confused as a researcher myself. My second question is for Caoimhe that I've put into the chat. And that question is that given Caoimhe's study, the data is compiled and anonymized by Escort Ireland. As a researcher, those kind of the recent blogs about Ukrainian women being used to for the sexual interests of men who have an interest in war, like how do you kind of rely on one piece of evidence from somebody who can come out with blogs like that?
Well, I have addressed this in the chat a wee bit, so you can go back and sort of see what my answer is. In terms of if that post is up, I mean, that's gross, and sex workers are often used as you'll often get like horrendous ideas of what people should be able to do with sex workers, and that does come into word as exploitation. I mean, and absolutely, I agree. If that's the case, that's horrendous, and we'll look into it. It doesn't change that. I mean, if that is a recent blog post, that doesn't change data that we collected 4 years ago. You know, that data already exists. It's also data that we had access to. So we had our own researchers were able to access that, like from Queen's University, we were able to access that data and quantify it or confirm it in terms of the statistics. So yeah, if what you've said is true, it's gross, and I'm not standing over it. I'm still going to stand over the quantitative, like the actual like amount of adverts that we were given access to, and we were able to go in and confirm them ourselves. But so it doesn't change to me the statistical data about the amount of adverts that existed. It changes the context of where I work with Escort Ireland again, which would probably be a no.
Thanks for that, Mary. And
if I could come back in very quickly, sorry, just to follow on from Mary's comment.
Absolutely.
Why she should trust Amnesty's evidence. I mean, we've been saying repeatedly since 2015 and beyond that if states are going to introduce laws that so severely impact the human rights of any particular group, they need to do so on the basis of evidence. So the state should be carrying out this research. It has not. So Mary, I'd suggest that you look at all of the research that's available, be it ours, be it others, look at the methodologies that were employed, look at the bulk of evidence that exists generally, and then form your own view, form your opinion. I mean, obviously as a human rights organization, and I think as a very well respected campaigning and research-based organization, we absolutely stand over the integrity of our research, and we hope that our reputation stands for something in that regard. But take a look at the research that exists generally. But also, I think if you think there's gaps in research, you and just like us need to be pushing policymakers and legislators to be doing the research before they adopt positions or enact laws that so very clearly harm the human rights of some of the most vulnerable groups in our society.
Thank you, Colm. And Martina?
No, thank you, Raoul. Thank you to the speakers and even those who asked questions. They've informed my position, and I feel much more informed now, all right, about one particular kind of personal aspect that I had with this topic. The one thing that jumps out at me is the piece around, you know, the distrust of Gardaí, and even the fact that the Gardaí are not compiling any sort of statistic around, you know, offences against sex workers. I really struggle with that. I think that's an appalling gap on their part, and locally, certainly, previously our Joint Policing Committee never presented the sexual assault and rape figures as such at that forum, and they do now, since we pushed for it there when we went into local government. But I'll be trying to see, you know, would reporting of crimes against sex workers further expose them rather than be of benefit? I suppose that's sort of my my question. Or would it be useful to probe the Gardaí's own opinions and challenge their position? They're kind of the questions I suppose I'm thinking of. There may not be time to answer those now, though.
Just in the interest of time, what I might do, Martina, if that's okay, I might bring in Susan to ask her question as well, and we could have them both answered at the same time. Susan? She might have,
yeah, sorry, I'm here. Yeah, no, I actually put it in the chat box. I was just wondering, from the point of view of just as an arts practitioner, I worry that there isn't enough of this narrative in the arts world, and there's not enough of that story, because recently a survivor, a former sex worker called Mia Doring, brought out a book and about her experiences, and she has a very kind of it was very much abolitionist, sex negative kind of swerf kind of stuff, and everybody, the whole literary world really just went along with it and kind of agreed with it and retweeted it and said, yes, this is what has to be done. There was a little bit in an interview, I think with Roisin Ingle, there was a little bit of another point of view, to be fair, but in general, I feel that it's just a lot of the time, like with the complaint the Trans Writers Union made against the review of Abigail Shrier's awful book in The Independent. I think that the arts world and literary world are too credulous of these narratives and aren't pushing back enough, and not to challenge a survivor, that's not what I mean, but just to actually maybe start telling these stories more and kind of subverting the narrative. And I'm wondering what's the best way to do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. And I just see Moira's come in there. So I'll ask Moira if you can just ask your question, then we'll group them together. And if the speakers wouldn't mind, and hopefully then we can let you off the hook for the evening.
Thanks a million. I think what I just wanted to say is, today I sat with 4 children who are in 6th year in a school, and all 4 of them revealed that one was transgender, one was non-binary, one was bisexual, and the other was gay. And none of them had come out in their 6 years in school to their friends or their teachers. And all of them are migrant young people. So what really struck me was at the heart of the question that I asked Colm. I do not stand on a high moral ground. I don't stand on any rights of mine needing to supersede anybody else's. But when I hear 4 young people not comfortable to talk about sex in Ireland, if we don't start with finding a way of being comfortable with expressing our own opinions and attitudes towards sex, we can't possibly even contemplate the life of a sex worker as something legitimate or illegitimate without doing that first. So my intention is never to patronize, to make others feel that one way is right and one way is wrong. My intention is that we would all look at what we believe sex is now in 2022 in Ireland, because it's quite different to what we were told to expect it to be growing up. So thanks for letting me say that. That's it.
Thanks, Maura. And I think that's an excellent pointer to kind of go to our speakers on. I think that's why we're all here this evening. We're all here to learn, and all here to learn how to do better, to represent all in society. So I think that was an excellent point to kind of wrap up the Q&A on. And if I could just ask the speakers to come back on Martina's, Susan's, and I am forgetting who the other person is. Apologies, sincere apologies. I think it was Martina and Susan. So if you wouldn't mind coming back on those questions.
I'll just jump in first if that's okay. Yeah, so just in terms of the Martina's point about like the recording of data. Well, firstly, Ireland is supposed to, under the Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women. I know we're talking about violence more generally. Ireland is meant to be recording kind of like all the data on like laws and reporting and how how violence against women is recorded in terms of like the disaggregated data for the purpose of like sort of figuring out like what's working, what isn't. So that would extend clearly to other groups impacted. So yeah, I mean, I think that Ireland in terms of like capturing the data is pretty poor across the board. In terms also of sex workers' use of other services beyond including health services and so on. But again, the problem with the Gardaí is that we've met with them and they said that they are operating on the premise that the vast majority of sex workers are actually trafficked or exploited. So they would be looking at kind of like, yeah, I mean, maybe, I don't know. Anyway, but I think that ultimately, though, in terms of like the police data, we need to bear in mind the fact that the Gardaí are looking at this through the prism of organised crime and organised gangs, whatever that means. So their prosecution purposes and their investigation purposes seem to be more about detecting that sort of crime rather than providing a kind of like as being a safety net for sex workers. So that's a conversation that we will continue with them. In terms of the point about like sort of the different kind of like sex workers that have come forward telling their story. Well, for instance, the author of that book, I mean, entered into kind of like sort of the sex trade as a minor. That's child abuse. That's not sex work. That is like, when we talk about sex work, we're talking about over the age of 18, consensual and all that, but like it's not consensual. It is any engagement of a child in commercial sexual activity under the age of 18 is child abuse. So when you have that entry into sex work, it's quite different than others who choose sex work for reasons, all sorts of reasons. We've people who choose it to fund their university studies. They have options, and this is the one that works for them. So we cannot paint everybody with the same brush. Sex workers have very different experiences, and that will inform their views, and we need to completely respect that. And then coming back to Linda's point, we're putting too much burden on individuals to come forward to tell their stories, as if this somehow, I mean, it's important. I mean, that's the way that Amnesty does its research. The individual story proves the lie or truth of a government's policy, but that's not to say that they are representative. So that's the government's job. So, and again, like sort of, and finally, what was the final point again? Sorry, that Moira, your point was about the sexual and RSE. Yes, absolutely. We've been campaigning for relationships, sexuality education in schools as well for many years. And the whole issue about consent and stuff was also brought up by sex workers, where they felt that even some of their clients did not understand what consent meant. So from a very young age, that we need to be empowering our young people to be able to confidently talk about, sex, sexuality, consent, what is okay to do with their bodies and what isn't. And so we're very much supportive of what you say there.
Colm, you're muted.
Colm, yeah, I was just going to say thanks, Linda.
Sorry, I was pressing the wrong space bar because I disconnected my keyboard a moment ago. And yeah, if I can just come in and just add to that, like obviously there are a huge range of issues that are underpinning, tangential, related to the experience or the pathways, to the experiences or pathways that cause people to end up in sex work or that cause people to choose to enter sex work. And there are whole loads of things that we need to do to make sure that people have a range of choices that are available to them, so they can make different choices if that's what they wish, or so they can exit sex work if that's what they wish. And equally, on that point about conversations in Ireland around sex and sexuality, like I found myself having some very odd conversations over the years that are deeply personal because they were necessary to begin to try to get Ireland to move beyond particular entrenched positions on particular issues. And I think if we look back to the referendum to repeal the 8th Amendment, and indeed the referendum on marriage equality, we really need to get to a point as a society where we don't require people to expose trauma and vulnerability and pain and struggle and difficulty and their simple humanity, so that it can be dissected and debated by people, so their validity or their value can be decided upon, and they become objects of public discourse and fodder for newspaper articles. It's obscene. It does untold harm and damage to people. And if we think about doing that to a particularly stigmatized, marginalized group in an effort so that the rest of us could just recognize their simple humanity and the fact that they possess rights, that's, from my perspective, just obscene at this point, and we shouldn't be requiring it in 2022. So yes, there's a whole lot of things that we need to address, from relationship and sexuality education to bigger, better, deeper, more meaningful, more considered, more enlightened conversations around sex. We should do all of those things. But as we work to do those things, we have to, in the first instance, begin to address laws and practices and attitudes and discourses that subject this most marginalized group of people to appalling human rights violations that are absolutely preventable. So that's the piece where we have to start from as we continue. It can't wait for us to do those other bits in order to fix this. And obviously they're all important, but we have to dismantle laws that further marginalize and leave sex workers even more vulnerable right now in 2022.
Colm, just before I bring in Caoimhe, I think that was a very profound and excellent contribution. Caoimhe, if you want to come in there just before we wrap up.
Yes, and I'll be very quick, and I do have to really reflect what you just said there. I think that was a really important contribution you've just made there, Colm. On the quick questions, or I'll be very brief on this. So Martina's question about distrust of the Garda. In the north, the police have taken a much more hands-off approach. So this law is now seen, the law is kind of seen as being sort of indicative of like what is the correct morality, as opposed to having any real legislative like back. And the police basically think it's a waste of time. The PPS think it's a waste of time, and that's not been the case in the Republic. So even in cases where a sex worker, like, where they can't get them for brothel keeping or they're like living off the money that you get from sex work, but they can't get them for that, what the police have been doing is like informing your landlord that you're a sex worker. So the guards have actually like been quite proactive in being anti-sex work. And I do think that goes back to what Fiona says, is the lens that they see it through. They're seeing this through an entirely human trafficking lens. They think they're attacking organized crime, and that's just not the case from the research. And if they were doing the research, they would find this out for themselves. Second question was about the art on how certain stories are picked up, and I think there's a really and again in the north there's a particular story that is given over a particular narrative of a person who was trafficked, which we're not trying to make legal. You know, like I'm not supporting sex trafficking, but this story was put up quite a lot pre the law coming in to say why we definitely need this law. And I think there's a real cynical motivation to this, because if they actually really cared about the vulnerability of sex workers, they would have put in anything to support people leaving the sex trade, anything in terms of like supporting people on gaps in their CVs or training or anything else. But what they do is just take these stories and put them forward and say, well, look how terrible sex work is. Look at this terrible thing done to it, but we're not helping you, you know. So I think there's a real cynical approach to that. And the final question, I think, yeah, I can't say much more than what Colm did. I do absolutely. We need to get out of this really like stunted idea of what we have about sex and sexuality in Ireland, north and south, to the point that we can talk about it, and also to the point that we can go, listen, see what's for you. It's not for me, but that's fine. And that kind of comes back to the sex work. I don't particularly want to be a sex worker, but I want to support the safety of people who do, because it's fine that somebody else does something that I don't necessarily want to do. Same with sexuality, same with, you know, trans, non-binary, etc. But that is, yeah, we have to get those conversations out so that I don't care what you're doing and it's fine. But until then, we have to get rid of laws that are causing people damage, as Colm said. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you. Completely agree with that. This idea of just because you necessarily wouldn't want to be involved in something yourself makes it wrong is something we really need to move forward from in Ireland, both north and south. And it's definitely something, it's certainly down in the south of Ireland, that we became very aware of as part of the repeal campaign. And we started to see people questioning that belief that just because I necessarily wouldn't choose a course of action, does that make it wrong or right? It's rather just, do you know what? let's move towards minding our own business and trusting people with their own decisions and their own bodily autonomy. I just want to say thank you very, very much to Caoimhe, to Fiona and Colm here this evening, and also to Linda for coming on and giving us the Sex Workers Alliance of Ireland position. It was a really great session. I want to thank all the contributors for asking the questions. I thought they were really insightful and informative, and it's really great to see so many people here who are willing to learn more, to try and do better. And that's all we can ask of everyone, and that we can just keep striving to ensure that everyone in our society is given the same rights. So thank you very much. And
I just, sorry, jump in very quickly. It's
of course.
Hi to my sister. Hello, my sister has arrived to see what it is that I do all day long. So that's easy.
Of course. Well, she picked a good evening to do it, because you have honestly really enlightened us all. And I have to agree with what Linda's put in the chat. The really loving Moira's statement at the end. And it's just really important to have these conversations with sex workers and have the voices heard. So thank you all for taking time this evening, and apologies it ran over, but I really do feel it was important just to let the conversation continue when it was flowing so well. And thank you to the speakers who've given up that extra time this evening. It was really very much appreciated, certainly by myself, and definitely I can be certain of the others on the chat based on the quality of questions that have been submitted. So thank you all. Thanks.